Hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. We will start this semester with the part 3 of the book, and part 3 of the book is about markets and welfare. So, in this chapter and the coming 3 chapters, we will be talking about the welfare and how the market system plays a vital role and increasing the welfare of the society. In other words, we will analyze how the free market system actually benefits both buyers and as well as sellers, and as a whole, it benefits the society. So, if there is a free economic system in a country, that's basically good for the society and it increases the welfare of that society, both for the sellers and also for the buyers of any product. So we will mainly argue that free economic system or the free economic system that most countries nowadays practice is an efficient way of managing the economy, and it increases the total social welfare. So that was a small introduction to the coming 3 chapters, and the topic of chapter 4 is consumers, producers, and the efficiency of markets. So our main purpose of this chapter is that we get to use and to be familiar with these economic terms. So these are consumer surplus, producer surplus, and the efficiency of a market. Okay, so I will start with the definition of welfare economics. Welfare economics is the study of how the allocation of resources affect economic well-being. So welfare economics is basically you see how resources are allocated in a society and how that affects the well-being of the members of that society. So welfare basically means, to put it in simple words, like how well off people are, or what's, for example, even the standard of living of that country. And we will study this topic from the economic point of view and how economics contribute to this field of welfare. Okay, so my main job is during this chapter is that you get familiarized with the terms of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and market efficiency. And if you get an introduction of these terms and these concepts, that's the main purpose of this chapter. And in the coming 2 chapters, we will build on and use these terms to further explore the topic of welfare economics. Okay, so I also wrote down that benefit for buyer and seller to engage in a market transaction. So whenever a buyer and a seller engage in any transaction, basically that increases or that brings profit for both buyer and seller. So we will explore this further throughout this course. And the main conclusion of this chapter would be that the equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes the total benefit received by buyers and sellers combined. So probably I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of supply and demand and market equilibrium. So when there is a market equilibrium of any product and there is the supply and demand and then there is the equilibrium in that market, that market equilibrium basically maximizes the total surplus or total benefit received by buyers and sellers. So to put it in a simple words, market equilibriums are the best method which will maximize the benefit to all those parties involved in any transaction. It could be buyers, it could be sellers, it could be the society as a whole. So these are the introduction remarks, and there is one further note that I've written down, and then we will start our main topic. So this topic basically also relates to one of the main economic principle. The principle is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. So this is one of the principles of this book and also of economics, and it says that when we put the market to function by itself, that's basically a best way or a good way to organize our economic activities. So basically market is an efficient way of doing any type of activity, so we leave it to the market efficiency, and that basically will generate efficiency for all participants of that market. Okay, so our first topic is so there are three topics in this chapter. The first topic is about consumer surplus, the second is about producer surplus, and then the third topic is about market equilibrium. So these are the three main topics, and there are subtitles also that I will read throughout this presentation. Okay, so our first topic is consumer surplus. So that's the main topic. Okay, so we start with the definition of willingness to pay. The willingness to pay is defined as the maximum amount that a buyer will pay for a good. And there is a example also in the book. So if there is any product and then you are willing to pay a specific amount to buy that product. For example, there is an iPhone 12 in the market, and then the price is, for example, 1,000 euro, but you don't know actually the price. So you are probably ready to pay 1,200 euros to buy that iPhone. But that iPhone is basically costs 1,000. So this 200 is basically your consumer surplus, or that is the difference between the amount that you are willing to pay and the actual amount that you actually pay for that product. So willingness to pay is the maximum amount that a buyer will pay for a good. So you are ready to pay 1,200 euros for an iPhone 12, but the price could be 1,000. So your willingness to pay is 1,200 and the actual cost is 1,000. So this 200 is basically your consumer surplus. What that means is if you buy that iPhone, so you are more happy because you are ready to pay 200 extra dollars to buy that iPhone, and that shows your willingness to pay. So you are more happy, so that increases your consumer surplus, or that increases your welfare. Why? Because you were ready to give away $200 on that iPhone, but you actually paid less than that, so you paid 1,000. So that's basically the concept of consumer surplus. I will read the definition of it. It says that the amount a buyer is willing to pay for a good minus the amount the buyer actually pays for it. So it's the difference how much you are willing to pay and how much you actually paid. So this $200, you are happy that somehow you saved this $200 because you are ready to pay, but now the price is quite low. So that actually increased your consumer surplus. So you are more happy buying the iPhone less than that. And still this 200 is like a measure of your welfare because you paid less, so you have saved 200, so you are happy with that, and this 200 counts for your consumer surplus. Okay. The next subtitle of the book is Using the Demand Curve to Measure Consumer Surplus. So basically, there is an example in table 1 and that there are 4 buyers and then their amount that they are willing to pay. So if you put all the amount they are willing to pay in one graph, like the prices on the y-axis and then the quantity on the x-axis, as it's in the figure 8, so basically you get a demand curve. So in this figure, it's like a rough demand curve of these 4 persons to buy this album. And okay, so from this curve, we actually could also derive the consumer surplus. If you see in figure 2 of the book or of this chapter, you will see that the consumer surplus is basically the difference between the price and the demand curve. So basically, it's an area. It's the area below the demand curve and above the price level. For example, in figure 2 and part A, so the price is 80, and then the area which is above 80, between 80 and 100, that's basically Taylor's consumer surplus, which is 20 euro. So to put it in a simple word, how do you measure a consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the area in the market equilibrium or in the graph of supply and demand. It's the area above the price and below the demand curve. So if you see the demand curve, any area which is below the curve but above the price is basically the consumer surplus area. Or you can find that in figure 2, you can also find that for 2%, 3%, and so on. So first, the demand curve shows buyers' willingness to pay. So how much you're ready to pay. For example, in the previous example, as I said, related to iPhone, your willingness to pay is $1,200. So that shows your demand curve basically, and the price is actually how much you have paid for that iPhone, which is 10,000, and this difference between your willingness to pay and the price is basically your consumer surplus. So that's why we can use the demand curve to actually measure and see how much a certain product or in a certain market, how much is the consumer surplus. To put it in a simple words again, the area above price and below the demand curve is consumer surplus. Okay, there is one subtitle, it says like how a lower price raises consumer surplus. So of course, as the price decreases, this area for consumer surplus will increase. So whenever the price goes down, the consumer surplus will increase. In the example of the iPhone, assume like now the price of iPhone 12 is not 1,000 but 800. But you are willing to pay $1,200. So now your consumer surplus is 400. Why? Because the price has decreased by 200, and then you are willing to pay 1,200, but now you are paying only 800. So this 400 is your consumer surplus, and that's you are happy that you have this extra money, that you have saved this extra money. So that's basically means like when the price goes down, basically the consumer surplus will increase. Okay, and there are two effects of that. So one is that the current buyer will pay less. So you were ready to pay 1200, but now you are paying much more less. And then the second effect is because new buyers enter to the market. So probably there were some other people who were willing to pay only 900 for an iPhone 12, and now because the price has decreased to 800, this person will also buy a iPhone, and then he has like 100 euro as a surplus or as a consumer surplus. So whenever the price decreases, the consumer surplus increases in two ways. First, the current consumer will have more consumer surplus, and second, new buyers will also buy that product, and as a result, their consumer surplus will also increase. So if you add both of them, in this case, the consumer surplus will increase as a result of decrease in the price of a product. Okay, the next subtitle is what does consumer surplus measure? Okay, so basically why we are interested in consumer surplus, we have been talking about it, but what that actually measure? So it's a measure for economic well-being. So first, it's a measure of economic well-being in a sense that it basically it actually helps you. It helps your economic situation. In the case of iPhone, because the price is low, or because your willingness to pay was much more higher, but you paid less. So your economic situation has improved, like you have saved 200 euros, for example. So that actually, if we are measuring this consumer surplus, it shows like, okay, people are that much happy to buy an iPhone. Like, although they have to pay a lot, but now they are paying less. So they have saved money, so they are economically well. And you can use 200 euros, for example, to buy food or to have a sport activity or whatsoever. So that will increase your satisfaction of life, or you will be more happy to have saved 200 euros. So that consumer surplus is basically measuring your economic well-being. So the more the consumer surplus is there, the more will be your economic well-being in this hypothetical exam. And it also satisfies the preferences of buyers. So it also shows like, for example, in this example of iPhone, so the iPhone will be bought only by those who will value it at least as equal to the price of that iPhone. For example, if you would have valued the iPhone 900, but the actual price is 1000, so you will not buy it. So because you will not get satisfaction from this purchase of the product. Why? Because you value iPhone less than that. But and the other way around, if someone prefers iPhone with 1200 euros, so basically if he received the iPhone for 1000, he is more satisfied with his preferences because he was able to pay more than actually the amount he paid. Okay, so that was a brief introduction to consumer surplus. Our second main topic is about producer surplus. So far we were talking about consumer, like those who buys a product. Now we will be switching off our lenses and talk about the producer's point of view, those who produce products and those who sell the product. Okay, So the first subtopic is okay, so benefits sellers receive from participating in the market. Producer surplus basically shows how much benefit producers receive if they participate in a market. What do I mean by participating in a market? That, for example, Apple is producing iPhone and they are selling iPhone. So we will see and explore what surplus the producer basically receive by selling an iPhone. Okay, the next subtitle is cost and willingness to sell. So basically, in order to measure the producer surplus, we have to know what is cost. Cost is basically the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good. So it's like the opportunity cost. It's also mentioned in the book. So it's the amount that, for example, the iPhone, the Apple company has to give up in order to produce one iPhone. Say, for example, they have machines, they have buildings, they have engineers and whatsoever to produce one iPhone. So for Apple company, the producing of one iPhone is all these costs that they have to incur in order to produce an iPhone. If they don't have to produce an iPhone, they could have used their engineers, their equipments to produce, I don't know, Mac computers or whatsoever. So the cost is it's quite clear. So if you produce something, of course you have costs, and that's the definition of the cost, as I said. So it's the value of everything that you must give up in order to produce a good. And then the second definition is the producer surplus. So what's basically producer surplus? It's the amount a seller is paid for a good minus the seller's cost of providing it. So producer surplus is the amount which a producer receives in terms of price of that product minus the cost. For example, producing an iPhone, it cost $800, like all the cost of the machinery, engineers, and so on is like 800. And the price that Apple received is 1,000 euros. So this 200 is basically the producer's surplus for iPhone by producing and selling an iPhone. So it's the extra benefit that the producer receive and engaging in production of iPhone and selling of this iPhone. Okay, so how we can find the producer surplus in a demand and supply schedule. So as you can see in figure 4, basically the supply curve is the cost of a company or a cost of the producer or supplier of one good. And you see like different supplier, for example, in this example, they have different costs. So of course they will sell their products above the cost, and that difference between their cost and the amount that they receive in terms of the price of that product is basically their surplus. So if you put it in a simple terms, the supply curve shows the different costs of different producers, and the area which lies below the supply curve and above the price, the area which is above the supply curve and below the price area is the producer surplus. You can see it in figure 8. So it's the colored area, which, for example, here the price is 800, and the area below 800 and above the supply curve is basically producer surplus area. So that's the amount that will benefit the producer of a certain product to produce one good and one surplus and sell it in the market. So I will repeat the definition of producer surplus. It's the amount a seller is paid for a good, so that's basically the price of the good, minus the seller's cost of producing it. So that will be all the costs that they have to incur in order to produce that good. So this difference is basically the producer surplus. I will show it in the example again. So if the cost of producing an iPhone is 800 and Apple is selling it for 1000, so this 200 is basically the surplus or the extra benefit that the iPhone company or the Apple is receiving. Okay, so the same as the consumer surplus, the next subtitle is using the supply curve to measure producer surplus. So as we have already talked about it, we can use the supply curve to find where or how much is the surplus for producers in a market. And that's basically below the price and above the supply curve. Okay, so I think that that will be enough about this point. So now you have a basic idea of producer surplus and consumer surplus, and now we will talk about our third topic. It's about market efficiency. Okay, I missed one point here from my notes. I will read it. So it's related to the point of how a higher price rises producer surplus. So what happens if the price increases, as we have seen in the consumer case? So if the price increases, basically that will increase the producer surplus. Why? Because producer will receive more money from selling their product. For example, if the price of iPhone is 1000, the cost is 800. Now the price has increased to 1200. So now the producer is receiving 400 as a consumer, as a producer surplus. Why? Because the price has increased, but the cost is still the same. So this 400 will add up to the producer surplus of Apple company. And as it was the case with the consumer surplus, there are two reasons for that. First is that the current supplier surplus increases, so those who are already in the market, so now they are receiving more money for iPhone. And it will also, the second reason is that new suppliers will enter the market and increase producer surplus. So now that iPhone is, for example, expensive, it's not a good example, but there could be more companies like iPhone which will come up to the market and say like, hey, the price of iPhone has increased, let's also produce similar product to iPhone or anything like that. So what will happen, like, because the price has increased, there will be more suppliers into the market, and that basically shows like when there is a high price, so the producer surplus will also increase. Okay, now I will go back to the last topic, which is the market efficiency. Okay, so we have come to know these two terms, consumer surplus and producer surplus, and both of them actually provide a basic tool for measuring welfare of buyer and seller in a market. So far we have been talking about them, and that's basically one way of measuring economic welfare or how satisfied people are with the market of a specific good. So with these two terms, we can now use them in order to see how that affects the economic well-being of the society or buyers or seller. It will also help us understand, for example, is it good to have a free market? Is it okay that Apple can decide to sell iPhone at any price they want, and people who want to buy it, they will buy, and those who don't want to buy it will not buy. So, and that's basically called the free market. So government is not regulating anything, and everything is free. So you can sell your iPhone for 2,000 or 3,000. Nobody is asking um, Apple company that why it's the case. And also buyers are free. So if you want to buy, you can buy iPhone. If you don't like, you think it's too expensive, you don't buy it, you are also free. So now we will use the consumer surplus and producer surplus ideas to see if such an economic system is really desirable, if such a system is really good for the society as a whole. And subtitle 3.8, there is one interesting story about the benevolent social planner. So in the book it says like think like there is one dictator and he wants to decide, for example, how much should be the price of iPhone and who will receive the iPhone or who will not. So he's basically planning who should get what and what should be the price. And yeah, and then you will see like this system will not help. Why? Because it will reduce both consumer surplus and also producer surplus.